Hello, fuckers. And others. Look, I stand my asexual and celibate audience, okay? And hey, at least it's a gender-neutral greeting. I'm here to share my thoughts and observations on a subject very dear to my heart. Waifus. Where to find and attract the best ooze. As is common practice, we'll start with the Northeastern American e-girl mating call. With traditional cotton candy undertones, of course. Oh, wait, no. I'm sorry. This is entirely the wrong video. We're meant to be talking about the topic of self-expression. Specifically, self-expression as it relates to your external appearance, whether that is clothing, tattoos, or many other body modifications. But there are a few contentions that I have with the way that this idea of self-expression is often perceived and understood. I got some fucking beef, okay? Not only that, but some of these contentions that I have are connected with a few of the roots of early-stage bigotry. My perspective, that we will later be diving into more meticulously, is that self-expression is far more important than many people give it credit for, to the point that the term really should be redefined or reimagined, since it seems the common understanding of the term is flawed, and that by exploring more of this definition of self-expression, that we can hopefully help society on a whole dig out bigotry in many of its forms at the roots. Wait, was I wrong again? Is this actually a botany video? We must clip out the disease branches and replant all of humanity in richer soil to allow the grafting process to thoroughly flourish. But before we really get into it, there are a few establishing concepts that need to be laid out, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. The first thing that I need to do is to clarify that throughout this video, I will sometimes be talking about how I think things should be, not always how things currently are. The prescriptive versus descriptive, which will require some level of imagination. I hope that does not rule any of you out. That being said, I would like to ask you to keep your arms in and wait until the end of the video before giving any feedback. So hold on to your protestive hat racks. Is protestive even a word? So let's quickly define the current state of the term or idea of self-expression. Looking at a few definitions from different dictionaries, except for the Oxford English Dictionary, which deviates from the others significantly by defining it as a classist paywall of $100 a year to find out, you cheap pig. But some of the other dictionaries, it seems like the term generally boils down to various ways that someone can express their personality. So what does that mean? That doesn't really explain it, it just sounds like another word for the same thing. Well, one of the things I've noticed is that there are two distinctly different ways that we use the term personality that is making this a little difficult to talk about. One way is to use the word to describe the core of an individual, who they are as a person, their values, etc. While the other version of the word seems to be used more topically, almost like seasoning. For example, if someone says, "You have a great personality, hun," the latter has more of a connotation of being sort of optional, sort of malleable, like it's more superficial. If you're going to make a joke, you make this joke this kind of way, while the other version of the word is meant to describe deeply ingrained traits for who you are as a person, your morals, ethics, temperament, what your love language is, what your perspective on life is. And a similar dynamic comes into play with the idea of self-expression as well. We have two different versions of this concept floating around in our zeitgeist. We have the version of this word to describe very topical traits, like it's just a meaningly aesthetical style that someone puts on. But then we also have a version of the term that is understood to be deeply meaningful by using it to describe the act of externally reflecting those core values that someone has in themselves to the outside world. But as it stands, I'm not aware that there is an easy way to communicate the differentiation between these two very different versions of this term. Self-expression is still currently treated like it's an umbrella term to talk about both the topical and the deep, which means the term occasionally is very unhelpful and confusing. Even if the dynamic is explained and understood, there will still be some people who will discredit the importance of self-expression. That even if they see it as being deep and meaningful, that it is still ultimately viewed as optional. But I do not see self-expression as optional. I view it more along the lines of a fundamental right that should not be violated, and we'll be getting into why that is later. I also do not believe that this perspective is simply the hang-up of a few select individuals. I think that this mode of discrediting self-expression is pretty deeply rooted in our society, even finding itself somewhat ingrained in the mindsets of people who would consciously advocate for self-expression, but might not realize that acceptance of other views they hold conflict with this sentiment. This is more specifically what we'll be getting into, while asking if discrediting self-expression is actually fair in some cases, or not, and if there even is any hypocrisy going on, or if it's just my poor little woke feelings getting hurt. In order to answer these questions, there is still yet another dynamic that needs to be considered, which is that the context of, and sometimes the answers to, these questions become very different when considering the environment that self-expression is being practiced in. Namely, the moments in the day when an individual is working for an employer, or when they are not working for an employer. In general, you'll have more people agreeing that outside of work, you can do pretty much whatever you want. Still within societal reason, of course. We can't have you walking around wearing the skins of your enemies and expect law enforcement to just give you a pass because God knows I've tried. But when we discuss someone expressing themselves while on the clock, that's when things get a little more controversial. What are the reasonable parameters of self-expression when working for someone? How much does it matter what kind of job it is that they're in? If you want to be able to express yourself during working hours, would the only way you could get away with it be if you worked in some creative role? Is that possibly a privileged situation to be in, even if you worked very hard to be there? Why is self-expression in the workplace largely treated as a privilege afforded to artists, but not for the masses? I'm sure some of this is related to the commodification of self-expression through not just art, but profitable art, via largely unfettered capitalism. If it doesn't make money, then you're not allowed it. But again, I come back to the question of how reasonable is this? Some people accept this and others don't. Why? I think some people dismiss this question very simply by saying, well, some people are just spoiled, or, well, some people are just dramatic. But I think the truth is much deeper than that. Now, I've been focusing on self-expression in the workplace, which we'll be hopping back to in just a moment. But it's important to realize that these two fronts do not exist in a vacuum. That there is a relationship between how someone's self-expression is accepted when off the clock, as well as how they are accepted while on it. So acceptance of self-expression outside of the workplace is still something that needs to be unpacked. And this is where, despite the initial general impression of having more acceptance outside of the workplace, I can hear some faint protests beginning to increase in volume, and if you listen very closely, you can hear them saying, well, hold on just a moment. I support your right to be who you want, so long as you don't make a big deal out of it and force me to accept you. So we're going to have to tackle this mentality too. Because, fam, this support doesn't cut it. If there is not explicit acceptance of people outside of the workplace, then I think it is a fantasy to expect there's going to be even a chance of acceptance for those same people within the workplace. It requires people to not just tolerate others, but to explicitly accept them. These two things aren't the same. But even if you agree that we should generally aim to accept others, this still demands some sort of qualifying parameters. Like, what metric do we use to decide whether to accept someone or not? Basically, how do we judge another person? Oh, but honey, I don't judge. Well, we say this, but we all still do it even if you think we don't. It's an unavoidable necessity of existence. It just might be that you judge someone by more accepting parameters, or just different parameters than others. Or it's just that some people might judge using specifically flawed metrics, therefore making us use the word judge as a shorthand for flawed methods of judging. Flawed metrics that usually require someone to force conclusions where they shouldn't. So again, how do we judge properly then? Well, one general starting point for how to judge another person, a starting point that we're going to have to agree on, is that if you are going to judge someone as an individual in general, the only way you can reasonably do this is by looking at the content of their character. But what does that mean? How do you judge the content of someone's character? Well, I understand it to mean that you're looking at the actions and the choices that that person's made. And if I guessed, I would say that I think that this is what most people do, or at least it's what most people think they do. It's just that there is at least one pretty significant problem with this general approach that I don't see being acknowledged often, or at all, which is that it is possible that someone can view nearly everything through the lens of choice. To view that you choose which religion you practice, you choose which culture you involve yourself in, you make choices that affect your socioeconomic status, and something that you even choose how much you align with your perceived gender, and even that you choose what your sexual orientation is. Now, despite how important it is to talk about all of these topics directly, because there is a lot to unpack there, I'm not going to get into the details of how choice is or is not involved in each of them, because there is honestly so much there that it would commandeer this entire video. Although I will be circling back and touching on some of these to highlight the unifying problem that they all share. For now, they are just examples of topics that you know people have debated on or judged someone on for a long time, and still do. So this metric of judging people based on their actions, their choices, it creates an unusual problem that for a long time I didn't realize existed. Or at least my realization was not with such clarity. And while judging someone by looking at their actions and their choices is still a reasonable general starting point for a metric, knowing when and how to use a good metric is still something that is open to abuse and human error. And what I'm attempting to do here is highlight that this metric has a sort of tricksy psychological loophole for people to continue judging others in ways they shouldn't, under the guise of, oh, I'm not judging you for being part of X group. I'm judging you for your choice to be involved in X group. Your choice to express your involvement in X group. Which sounds a lot to me like discrimination rebranded. Bigotry 2.0. There are a lot of very small, nuanced ways that this can play out, so it might take a little while to mull over what I'm describing before realizing how prevalent this is, especially since I, for one, haven't personally heard anyone else talk about this dynamic or loophole in quite such a direct way before. And I think part of that is just because of how difficult it is to describe. Now, as I was writing this video, I came across this problem where I kept having to describe this loophole dynamic over and over until I finally realized I should probably just give it a name. So, for better or worse, I decided on this: the choice discrimination paradox. Oh, I'm sorry. I did it wrong. The choice discrimination paradox. There. Does the name not sound grand? It, probably sounds more grand than it should. Anything with the word paradox in it, I think automatically sounds as if it's incomprehensible. But, you know, I thought I'd go big with this one. To go along with this very grand name, I did my best to create a working definition for it, which I am open to modifying, but currently it is as follows. The choice discrimination paradox states that in a society that holds two ideals, one that individuals should generally not discriminate against for being a part of a given demographic, and two, that individuals should instead be judged on the basis of their actions and their choices, a paradox, or loophole, can form where the choice of an individual to engage in these groups they belong to can still be judged negatively, in place of judging the individual simply for existing as part of these demographics. So hopefully, highlighting this dynamic will help clarify this tricksy thing that I think many people do without realizing what they're doing. I have some thoughts, some ideas on what to do about this problem, even if it's purely a general starting point to further explore, while also showing how it relates to bigotry and towards self-expression. Uniforms and dress codes. Uniforms and dress codes. That thing that plagued nearly all high schoolers, especially those of the private school type. But not I. I was homeschooled, and my dress code was that of PJs and hand-me-downs, for I had naught to impress. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that definition I just gave, but we're going to leave directly talking about that for a while and chat a little bit about uniforms and dress codes, which is one of the battlegrounds that the paradox's loophole is used in. Culture, religion, sex, gender, all of them have butted heads with the topic of uniforms and dress codes at some point or another, often negatively and disproportionately affecting minorities and feminine-presenting individuals. And as work is such a massive chunk of an individual's social hours, suppressing employees' identity during this time has a large impact on a notably diverse number of people. My perspective is that the dress codes, and even sometimes uniforms, in a surprising number of cases, do not do all that much, actually. And boy, do I have a fun personal story for you about my experience with all of that I'll be sharing with you later on. This brings me to one of the most exciting questions in this video, which is, what even is the difference between a uniform and a dress code? Are they different? Does it matter that they're different? Are either of them actually useful? Have you ever mulled over the intricacies of this topic before? Listen, this is the peak of the video. If you haven't left by now, the questions get even worse from here. These chords are a little more dommy than I prefer. It's a boring question, I know, but thinking through this nonsense is unavoidable if we want real answers. So, although these two definitions, uniforms and dress codes, often intertwine and overlap some, to my understanding, a uniform is typically something that is added to your person, usually an entire outfit, that every other person in your category will have, whereas a dress code is often some sort of modification or limitation to your appearance, like making sure your beard is shaved, or that the types of clothes that you can wear are limited to only a few different options, likely with something you would already have in your wardrobe. But more importantly, what about the functional perspective? What is the function of a uniform? What is the function of a dress code? Uniforms can have at least two major purposes. One is for physical utility. If I'm a soldier, I better be wearing the correct uniform for the job so I don't jank up my hands and knees if I need to do some climbing or crawling or something. But the other function is for identification. You definitely want to make sure you're shooting at the right targets, or if you walk into a store, you want to be able to easily recognize who works there. A dress code can also have two functional purposes. One is for conforming to social norms, and the other is for conforming to a specific brand representation, neither of which I view as being all that's legitimate. But why am I asserting this? Is it just because I'm a selfish rebel who don't like playing by the rules? I mean, you could call me a bit of a rebel, sometimes it's true. I don't like some rules, but I usually personally pride myself for following the functional rules that did not stomp on my identity in nearly every job I've held. More on that later. There is the pride of being dutifully uncompromising, uninfluenced by manipulation and outside forces, reliable. I think I've often been what someone might call a stickler for the rules. Typically, the rules just have to make sense, have some sort of logical utility, and I will follow them to the letter, as they say. Now, the uniform and dress code rules that made more sense to me than the more general retail dress code rules that I've seen would be ones I experienced when I was working as an intern, aka a serf, a peon, a minimum wage employee at Walt Disney World. Even though the uniforms and dress codes still grated on my soul, and even though I found many other aspects of working there concerning, some of the dress code rules there technically made more sense to me than any old retail store, because there is a very obvious concerted effort in their parks to be themed in a specific time period or a specific culture. The position more directly hinges on a particular appearance, where many other jobs could not claim to have this dynamic in anywhere near the same scope. The jobs at Walt Disney World can be viewed more directly as acting or performance jobs, yet there is still the part where they were not paying their interns or even some of their regular employees nearly enough to be performing both the job of an actor / performer, as well as the job of server or custodian or salesperson, etc. Though I will note that this was several years ago that I worked there, so hopefully they've made some changes. I actually found out while writing this that Disney's dress code recently opened up to allow for more inclusivity, including tattoos and beards, which is good to hear. So, to summarize, I don't have any issue with dress codes or uniform rules that have a direct and obvious utility to them, ones that are reasonably quantifiable for doing the job. My main contention is when it comes down to aspects that are more along the lines of enforcing some sort of social norm or social image. So why is that? What's going on with social norms? Well, we're going to have to take a closer look at those as well. Before we move on to that, though, I'll leave you with some questions to further ponder on your own time about the utility of uniforms. Like, does a judge perform their job better if they're wearing their judicial robes? Would they be unable to pass the same judgment if their hair was in a mohawk? Is the robe meant to, trick you and others into treating them with more respect? Does it have a +5 to the respect stat? Why would a robe do that? It's the same person. If the people judged a judge for having a mohawk, does that make the judge's judgment less valid? Do some uniforms give you a false sense of trust? Does not having a uniform count against you in some situations, when really you should be receiving just as much respect? Pause the video now while you write down your answers. So the thing about many social norms is that there's a side of them that is useful. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that there is a legitimate utility to following some levels and types of social norms, just maybe not all of them. For example, one of the general utilities of following social norms is ease of communication, which, notably, is not exclusively a verbal aspect. Another utility can be to signal to other people, hey you, I'm just like you, I'm a safe dude, you know what to expect here, nothing weird, totally good. And look, I get it. Sometimes you do meet some people who seem a bit off, as if they're not grounded in reality. Although that can be moderately subjective, but still, in a way, it might make it hard to feel like you can trust what you'll be receiving from them. Though I should also note that this can sometimes simply be a case of being judgmental or neurodivergence. So it's always good to still treat others with kindness and respect. But the thing is, either way, more often than not, it seems like basing trust off of someone's external appearance is not a good way to judge. Although, of course, exceptions do apply, like if they have a Nazi tattoo or something, that might give you a good clue about the type of person they are on some very important philosophical fronts. So, one of my primary disagreements still comes down to the social norms of your physical appearance, not necessarily some set of behavioral social norms that are useful purely for more direct communication, even though there's still some overlap, as some of those behavioral social norms shouldn't always be judged quite so harshly. And this is where we start to veer into that area I defined before, the choice discrimination paradox. Sorry, I meant the choice discrimination paradox. It's something that can bleed into every area of life because you can choose to appear in a way that breaks broader social norms, as I well know. But I'm still going to hold off on talking about that directly for now. So, for a moment, consider how many completely normal presenting people you've met that actually turn out to be kind of horrible human beings. Or, okay, maybe we don't have to be quite so extreme. Maybe they aren't horrible, but you discover they're generally kind of an ass, or maybe they're consistently dishonest, or maybe they liked the ending of Game of Thrones. No, God! Do you find any of those things out through the clothes they wear or how they do their hair? Did I miss where people are handed out t-shirts for things that actually matter? Like how kind they are? Ah, wow, yes, I see you're wearing the level 3 party comedian khakis. You must be hilarious to chill with. Oh wait, but I see you're wearing the level 5 abuser bracelets. Yikes. Sounds kind of ridiculous, doesn't it? Why then does it seem some of us still kind of do that for social norms regarding physical appearance? I'm sure some people have answers to this question, something to do with in-groups and out-groups, or about how it appears that most people are basing some of their opinions on personal interactions they've had 2 or 3 times with people who belong to a group of hundreds of thousands or even millions, which is kind of a small sample size to base an opinion off of, but I can almost guarantee that none of the answers to that question of why we do this would be positive or good reasons. Maybe a better question is a prescriptively leading one of, should we be doing this? My conclusion is no, we should be actively discouraging judging people so harshly based on their physical appearance, even the parts of their physical appearance that involve choices that the person made. But Caleb, sure, it's fine to look how you want if you're walking around during your free time, but when you're working for a company, a business has a right to tell you how they want you to appear, don't they? You're representing their company after all, and they're paying you. Now, there are multiple contentions I personally have with this mentality, some of which I've alluded to earlier, sure, but one of the contentions I want to hone in on is that typically, a company is not compensating their employees anywhere near enough to completely transform a person into becoming the face of a company. Now, I recognize that this is tough to argue because not only are many people already divided over what is fair pay in general, but this is an even more specific question within an already divided subject, as we're basically asking what the price of identity is. How do you determine the price of such a thing? It's like putting a price on a close friendship, or, as Anne of Green Gables would say, a kindred spirit. Ah, I bet you weren't expecting that reference, were you? Though, the thing about this is that the uncertainty of what the price of identity is works in both directions to a point. If the price isn't clear, then you could argue that the value that the company gets from stomping out their employees' identity isn't clear either. Though, this is a very case-by-case topic, as in, not only is this possibly difficult to parse through in even one particular case study, but beyond that, there are so many different kinds of companies that get very different amounts of value from choking out their employees' identity. Is the job in question customer-facing or behind the scenes? If it's customer-facing, is the company intentionally leaning into stereotypes or appealing to a specific demographic? And how ethical is that? Then, there is the fact that a specific employee's identity may or may not happen to be very important to them compared to someone else in the same role, or even if it's just as important to them as everyone else, the employee may not realize how important it is because they've taken their identity for granted, since it just happens to align with the majority and therefore has never been challenged. So, while there can be a lot of dynamics to consider, my main concern here is how fair are we being to companies? I mean, I just want to make sure they're getting the most value out of all of their thralls. That if they're going to squeeze out people's identity, that it's not just minorities that they're that they're gaining a profit from, but that they're making sure everyone suffers for them equally. The companies just work so hard, you know, they deserve everything from the oppression that they dish out. It must be so hard treating their employees like that. I mean, they really need a break. So if we're going to do our best to suppress ourselves for them, we should know what value that suppression is offering, so we can do a better job of it. So what we're talking about here is basically brand representation. Or, another way you can think about it, if you want to corporealize businesses, is a business's identity. In the US especially, this usually means that the business has rights that are pretty much just an extension of the owner's beliefs or desires. But my own personal understanding of this is that this is a bastardization of human rights to extend some person's autonomy out into a business entity to the point where it stifles some of the worker's own personal autonomy. The response to that view is, well, the employee agreed to it. They're basically under a contract that they agreed to. But I would like to point out that we do have some laws that do limit what another person is allowed to agree to, even under contract, for good abuse prevention reasons. And besides that, since employment is basically mandatory for survival, then the choice to not have a job that stifles you in some way is basically non-existent in practice. My perspective is that the only manner in which a business's autonomy should be considered is as it directly and reasonably quantifiably relates to doing the literal work required for the job, not if they want you to look a certain way, especially when it has nothing significant to do with your ability to perform your job's role, and so long as it's not some sort of hazard. Although even those angles have been abused by companies at times by exaggerating the impact of some things. In a more general sense, my view is that controlling employees to this extent, while maybe not the worst form of dehumanization by far, is still notably dehumanizing. Now, in a roundabout way, society sort of does this to itself. No one wants to be confined and constrained or judged for their appearance, but then you still have some people enforcing these societal expectations even while they don't believe in them when asked. What is actually wrong with someone else wearing a piece of clothing that isn't part of our particular culture or subculture? That does what exactly? Am I still getting treated well by this employee? Am I being helped by them? Are they doing their functional job? Of course, part of this is that many businesses are risk averse, which means that they will use whatever is at their disposal to protect their bottom line, social norms included. Wow, so enlightened. Much wisdom. If they were able to figure out that revenue would stabilize by 0.01% if everyone in their store had their hair length at exactly 17.5 centimeters long in a straight round bowl cut, they would enforce it. Now, not to completely remove businesses' responsibility in all of this, but I do see many decisions that companies make on this topic as being driven by larger societal expectations first, even though there is a sort of symbiotic or maybe parasitic relationship between the two. Like, if no one in society expected conformity like this in the first place, the conformity wouldn't happen. There would then be no reason for businesses to take advantage of this dynamic because it wouldn't exist to take advantage of. This is why I see dress codes as primarily being driven, initially, by nothing more than a social norm. And not that this is likely to happen anytime soon, but what do we think would happen if we all suddenly stopped expecting that this is just the way things are? If we let people present themselves however they like, even if this would result in some people going absolutely wild with this concept all the way to the clown store, in their red honking noses and size 69 shoes. Nice. You know, like we all want to deep down in our hearts while working retail. Clown retail rights, big issue. How have you not heard of it before? If we let everyone just do what the hell ever, as long as it doesn't severely impair the ability to do the functional aspect of their job, nothing bad would happen into society as a whole. In fact, I think quite the opposite would happen. I think people would be happier and probably perform better if they were able to just be themselves. I also think day-to-day life would be generally more interesting if I was able to see a more openly diverse set of personalities wherever I went. Though, it should be noted that part of the problem is that some people's identity is wrapped up not in themselves intrinsically, but their identity is wrapped up in their external surroundings, what other people are like. So, if they see someone unlike themselves, this isn't just that another individual is exercising personal identity. It becomes an attack on their own identity because of their desire to control their external surroundings as this toxic extension of self-identity. Now, anecdotal as this is, I did see this loosening of dress code rules helping in my own personal life when working as a web engineer. I was able to dress however I liked, and it did help me work better because I did not have the constant friction of donning something that was so much not me, draining away at my mental resilience, which in turn made me happier, gave me more energy, and freed up some other energy, which all helped me stay focused on actual work. And I do think, in a less personal example, that this is one of the reasons Google and a lot of tech startups are much looser when it comes to the subject of dress codes. Now, some people definitely disagree with me about some of the things I've said regarding dress codes, I'm sure, but my perception of their disagreement is that it is a combination of both devaluing how important and powerful identity and self-expression is, even in themselves as they might not realize it, while also overvaluing the benefit that businesses get from enforcing a particular set of social norms. Though, I will say, admittedly, this conversation can get more philosophically complex once you bring in the concept of modesty, which there's a lot to unpack there, but I think I really don't have the time to jump into all of that here. Instead, I'll leave you with words from a very wise and famous philosopher, Drax the Destroyer.
You Earthers have hang-ups.
Rainbow Catbois. Meow, meow, the age has come. That of the cat boy. That is B-O-I, boy. The gender-neutral boy that we all are. The time is upon us to don ears and widow kitty uniforms, and the greatest crime of all shall be rewritten to be that of having lactose intolerance. Now, for those of you who don't see the importance of self-expression when it comes to representing it through your appearance, I think that possibly a good way for me to explain what it can feel like to be denied expressing your own natural internal state is to suggest imagining how you would feel if the majority of society, 85, 90, 95% of society, if the norm for society, for God knows what reason, were all different colors of the rainbow and cat ears. Meow. But also that this is the important part, imagine that you would also be expected to dye your hair in a natural color and wear cat ears like most everyone else. Especially if you wanted to get a job, because doing this would help you fit in. After all, most places of employment would require this in their very reasonable dress code rules. So fall in line, Garfield! If that's not your scene, if you somehow don't identify as a rainbow cat boy, how much do you think that all of this societal, political pressure, let alone the general expectation, would grate on you every day? How much do you think that you'd wish that you could just be yourself? Beauty, identity, it's in the eye, in the heart of the beholder, and no employer should be able to mandate how you represent your personal beauty, your identity, be it natural or alternative, bright or muted, artistic or fashionable. Yes, even while on the job. I don't stop being a human once I clock in. Excuse me. What I meant to say is that I don't stop being a cat boy once I clock in. Forgive me, oh great cat in the sky. You know, I'm gonna be honest, I don't think anyone who doesn't already understand is really going to be swayed by this analogy, especially because the economy of imagination for some is in a deficit, which is the very cause of not being able to understand or empathize with others unlike themselves. But if this analogy fails, at least I've done it for the memes. For the memes. So, very importantly, for anyone gearing up to say, well, if you don't like the dress code, just find somewhere else to work, it is, unfortunately, not that simple, since many or most places have discriminatory dress codes varying some depending on the field of employment or locations you're looking at. Your options to do this can be quite limited, if non-existent. I mean, what if I, being the emo, My Chemical Romance listening individual that I am, what if I don't want to work at Hot Topic? Identity does not necessarily or even predominantly signal any sort of specific set of skills, let alone the idea that people are allowed to be diverse and have more than one area of interest. I know it's easy to think that all alternative-looking individuals are only meant to be working in designated alternative locations, like some creative role, but some alternative-presenting people would be really great in the medical field or great in the legal field. But while there are absolutely other factors at play that could affect someone's decision here, many may wind up veering away from choosing those types of jobs because they would have to or be pressured to forego a large part of their own identity in order to do this. According to this mentality, despite there being people that would literally have the functional skills to excel in these positions, you would basically be regulating an inefficient society just on the basis of appearance. So who is it that are really the ones who are concerned about aesthetics here? The people who don't work in certain job positions because, despite their capability to fulfill the role, they choose not to hold a position that limits their expression? Or is it the companies that enforce the dress codes in the first place? Because I do see an argument for both sides, but one of them has more systemic power behind them, and surprise! It's not the individual who cares about their own well-being, mental health, and peace of mind. Like, in this rainbow catboy thought experiment, what if you'd actually do quite well in a coffee shop because you're a coffee expert and you love socializing, but unfortunately for you, the gas station is the only place they'd accept monochromatic strays. That coffee shop now loses out on having someone who really would have genuinely enjoyed working there, and this catboy would have thrived, further benefiting the shop. Another very important dynamic to revisit and further address is that the importance of, or the weight that an individual puts in their own external representation varies from one person to another. So even if you would be totally okay donning colored hair and cat ears without feeling like your identity is being stomped on, maybe you really just do not care about donning any societal norm, it's important to recognize that this isn't the same for everyone, that it means a lot more to some than to others, and you cannot tell anyone how important this should or should not be to them, since besides it just generally being rude and out of line, you also simply don't have the same level of insight into their life as they obviously do. Maybe they've had their identity taken away from them in some regard, or directly or indirectly, recently or far into the past. And self-expression is a way for them to reclaim what was lost, to assert on some level that you don't own me, I do. But if you've never had your identity taken away or misunderstood or manipulated by others, it very well could be seen as a complete non-issue. Okay, Caleb, but wearing or not wearing cat ears and coloring your hair isn't an identity. That's ridiculous. Well, barring the fact that if this is your response to the thought experiment I pose, that you'd be missing the utility of the thought experiment by not entertaining the idea, another important aspect to external identity is that in many cases it isn't meant to be the entirety of someone, only a representation of their identity. It's symbolic. However, to deny the symbolism of something is to deny the thing itself. I think it's easy to forget that symbolism isn't something only left to divine shrines and holy hand grenades. So reducing someone's external appearance down to simply be some unfamiliar aesthetic is missing the point entirely. For example, it would be like someone saying the Holy Grail is literally just a cup. Well, of course it's not so much that it's the fact that it's a cup, right? It's symbolic. It represents a part of my main man, cool guy Jesus' story. And in that case, there are even many additional contextual details that someone from the outside might not know about the Holy Grail that makes it so important. Though the aspect that it's a cup isn't completely irrelevant either, it's kind of both at once. Kind of important and kind of not important, just in different ways. This is one of the reasons that this whole topic is so difficult to describe sometimes, because the external representation of someone can be simultaneously extremely important in one regard, but also not important at all in another regard. I think it's helpful to understand self-expression as a reflection of your experiences, any and all of them. Anything from personal beliefs, religious or spiritual, to gender, binary or non, to culture, macro or sub. Think of it like a record or a transcript of your experiences. It is your personal history, and those that control their history control the future. And it makes me think that if that power is taken away from you, who exactly is controlling your future? So when a company strips you of your self-expression, they are stripping you of that history, of some of your experiences, some of your humanity, and therefore some of your power, and your ability to find connections with others that may have similar experiences or goals as you. Self-expression is a form of non-verbal communication, of which there are many dialects. If you don't speak the language, you won't understand the messages. So when you see something that you don't understand, it's not always as simple as it's just dumb or silly or I don't like the way it looks. There may be layered meaning in what you're seeing that you don't know. And then sometimes it's just because someone likes the way it looks and that's okay. Okay, so we've talked about some dynamics as it relates to social norms and dress codes, and we've had this absolutely groundbreaking Catbois analogy, which I don't think is quite enough to show how important it is to unpack the concepts of the choice discrimination paradox, or how all of it relates to self-expression. So the last thing that we need to include before we start tying everything together is to ask one very important question that came up during the time I spent studying and considering this topic, which is, what is the difference between my strong convictions on all of this and the strong convictions of a religion, or the identity of a large culture that may or may not have afforded someone the freedom to exercise their culture or their beliefs in the workplace in a way that my personal or individual beliefs and culture do not. Culture, subculture, religion, beliefs. Tribalism. All of life is tribalism. I ask you this. Why did we not have classes on how to be a good little tribalist in school? Add that to the long list of things they didn't properly teach in the classroom, along with personal finance, psychology, and common sense. I want an A+ on my test on how to be a proper cultist. How else am I supposed to know if I'm doing it correctly? Of course, tribalism doesn't need to be taught in the classroom. We teach it pretty well to ourselves and others without explicit directions, while probably not even realizing it. And it's not exclusive to religion. It happens with pretty much every cultural grouping, even groups I find myself generally aligning with. Though, an important caveat to keep in mind is that the tribalistic behavior is not necessarily proof that a particular stance, group, or culture itself is fundamentally bad, just that the way some people go about defending their position, their identity, is weak, insecure, and toxic. It's entirely possible to hold the correct stance, but for the wrong reasons. But why am I bringing up tribalism? Well, unfortunately, tribalism has its hand mucking about in both the official rights that people are provided in the workplace, as well as our less official perception of other people's self-expression. Religion, culture, beliefs, really any social groupings are inextricably tied to the ever-present threat of giving into tribalistic behavior, and sometimes that includes our government and laws. And it seems society as a whole often does not directly try and combat that tribalism, especially since it does provide some pretty notable, often profitable benefits for some individuals. If you look at the rights that are provided to religions and cultures, especially in the workplace, and especially in America, but probably plenty of other places too, you may realize they don't always protect religions and cultures in general, so much as they protect large established religions and large established cultures, which is a very important distinction, because what this does is encourage tribalistic behavior. If you want protection from bigots and bullies, you will have more security by leaning into whatever larger culture or larger religion you choose or are predisposed to. So what are we supposed to do with this? Do we just accept that some larger cultures and religions will always have a bit more fairness, while minorities and subcultures and small religions are not going to ever receive the same level of security? Unless you've chugged a whole fucking carafe of black pills, that is understandably a difficult thing for many people to accept, at least philosophically, even if it is on some level accepted in practice. So again, I ask you rhetorically, what are we supposed to do with this? Well, if we are to assume, as I have been doing, that the goal is to accept other cultures and religions and allow them to exist, creating a fair environment for everyone so long as they do not invoke the paradox of tolerance, so long as the goal of fairness and inclusivity is similarly respected, the first thing we need to do is take a little bit of a closer look at what religions actually are and what cultures actually are. What separates a set of beliefs you personally hold from an established religion? Is it number of followers, time and history, proof of truthful teachings, intensity of spiritual conviction? All of the above? If we consider spiritual conviction, you could believe something so frickin' hard, like totally heckin' hard, but that would not give you acknowledgement from many people that you are practicing a legitimate religion. Maybe if you wrote down your beliefs in a holy text, I suppose that would help, but you would still be widely discredited in practice, I'm sure, especially in many workplace settings. If we consider proof of teachings, there is no way to actually confirm the totality of even long-established religions' validity, as doing so would conveniently require capabilities beyond human ability, like time travel or the ability to come back from the dead. If we consider time and history, does that mean that new religions are just not possible? Or at what point does it become legitimate? Is it once the religion is old enough to drive or maybe drink? Or was there some arbitrary date and time in the past where religions were no longer allowed to be established? Only new denominations from here on out. Or lastly, if we consider it to be a numbers game, which I do believe is a significant factor in how it's perceived at least, how many people does it take before your religion becomes valid? Do you need to have enough of a congregation for a football team, or just enough for a good old threesome? I'm sure many people have very different opinions on what constitutes a religion, but one perspective that is incompatible with figuring any of this out is the perspective that your religion is specifically factually the only valid one. It is one thing to choose to believe in something, but there is a difference between having faith that something is true versus treating the thing that you believe as fact. These two ideas are not the same. But for everyone else, if we treat other religions as possibly just as legitimate as our own, and we try to find the one thing that more prominent and established religions have in common in order to figure out a more holistic and inclusive definition, if we are searching for a commonality among all of them, and we leave the differences out so we can find out what they share, the most prominent similarity besides numbers is just strong beliefs in something, whether that something supposedly came from a divine prophet, enlightened wise men with holy text, or a literal god. So if we recognize that there really is no fundamental difference between having beliefs and having beliefs that are channeled through the label of a specific religion, this notion that religious freedom exists and is protected starts to become a bit of a hypocrisy. Often it's not so much that we protect religious freedom, it's that we protect large tribes of people that just happen to be flying the banner of a religious group. This doesn't sound very individual friendly. This just sounds like tribalism with a different label, a different aesthetic. And it is my perspective that we can separate the benefits that we all gain from being involved in a community or culture that support that security we receive without necessarily giving into the toxic elements that lead into tribalism and therefore bigotry. So how do we combat or counter tribalism? I'm sure there are many important and interesting strategies, many that I am probably unaware of and would love to hear shared within the community. But I believe an important starting point is to look inwardly. How can you properly diffuse tribalism if you haven't rooted it out in your own life? Are you certain that you have? If you haven't rooted out tribalism, then all you might be doing is becoming a convert in another tribe, and then looking for more converts. And while I would argue that in some cases this can still be a net positive, as it is not always a two sides of the same coin kind of scenario, that there can sometimes be tribes that are less toxic, more stable, and more inclusive as a whole, this does not mean that the toxic tribalism traits are entirely gone, that those fundamental toxic traits weren't necessarily entirely understood in the first place. So this brings me to a tiny but important confession. Something that is probably best for us both to acknowledge, which is my perspective has been colored by my experience growing up in America, but also going to a non-denominational Christian church every Sunday, going to vacation Bible school and studying the Bible on my own time at home, and being told and believing at the time that one of the wonderful things about America, the idea that I was told it was founded on, is that everyone was completely free to practice their religion and culture. Now, I am hesitant to use such a naughty word as propaganda, because I think it is easy to imagine that this word implies some sort of unified, intentional effort to tell a lie, but I think that this is not usually the reality of how this word plays out in life. That the propaganda is usually a story, a lie, that we tell ourselves. The community inflicts it on itself from within. So, over the years, I grew to find that the road of civil rights since America's founding was not necessarily so unifying and smooth. If you happen to be an individual who is yet ignorant of some of these events, even partially, as it is entirely possible because there is a lot to know about, especially if it was not something that you were taught about growing up, I will do my best to leave at least some links in the description, since going over all of these events is not my area of expertise, nor the main point of this video. I am mentioning them, though, to acknowledge that America, especially, has struggled to, and still has not hit that ideal that I was optimistically taught about in my childhood. An optimistic view of the state of things that I get the impression many other people were indoctrinated with as well. But as idyllic as what I'm advocating for is, I want to make sure that everything I've been saying is still grounded in reality, hence mentioning this history. And also just because I wanted you to know that I know that you know that I know. That you know that I know that you know. I know. There have been many civil rights issues that have been fought over in the workplace, related to culture and religious apparel, or tattoos or hairstyles, far into the past, but also still are being fought for in modern times. Expressing your culture or religion externally is a form of self-expression. I just don't think it's always thought of as such. And the issue that I have with this is that it seems to only be allowed if the self-expression is not just tied to, but recognizably tied to one of these larger cultures or religions. Now, I've cast a fair bit of doubt about the legitimacy of religious beliefs, and believe you me, I am far from done. But I want you to know that I am not trying to reduce them to be less than my own beliefs, but rather to put them on more of an equal playing field, because the legacy of some religions has been pretty fucking toxic. Some of them would have you believe that they are factually the only valid religion, but I won't name any names. And for a while, I honestly had a difficult time contending with why it was wrong for someone to believe this idea of there only being one true religion, since, as a person of passion, I don't think there is anything wrong with having a strong conviction about something. And indeed, there is not, necessarily, but it does depend on what that conviction is. Is it a conviction that is filled with tiny Nazis, or perhaps glazed with fascism? It is one thing to believe in something with conviction, and another thing to believe it with blind fervor, blind faith that amounts to being just as good as believing in nothing. Because you have no way of validating if you're believing in the wrong thing. But where was I? Ah, yes. I was about to have a bit of fun casting more doubt on the security of believing your religion is more valid than others by pointing out a very important hypocrisy that highlights the presumption of religious beliefs' legitimacy and security over anything anyone else believes. That there is an issue with the way some people view religion, maybe because they've sort of whitelisted some religions, maybe because they grew up with the religion and never really questioned it. So here is a situation that I've seen before to explain how this presumption of religious legitimacy can blind some into viewing their own beliefs as more secure than they actually are. And
I'm warning you with peace and love,
it's going to be spicy. So there are some people who take a pretty hardline stance against non-heteronormative sexual orientations using Christianity as an excuse for their views, right? And sometimes they make an argument that tries to appeal to a fear and uncertainty about the structure of society, precedents that are set. I know, it's a very visceral one. Sometimes I just wake up in the middle of the night screaming, "Oh no!" But what about the societal structure? But the argument goes a little like this. Oh, well, if we treat the gays and the rest of the LGBTQ brigade as a protected group, and there's no certain external identification that someone is a queer, how will we know if someone isn't just making it all up for some free minority protection and bonus benefits, like the attention of it all? Well, first of all, there's nothing wrong with a good bit of attention, but more importantly, what an excellent question, King James. Maybe we'll find out the same way we find out who believes in the one true God, by burning them at the stake. If their ashes turn to a deep obsidian color, then we know they were a non-believer. If their ashes are just dust in the wind, then we know they've been listening to too much Kansas. And if their soul leaves behind a shipping label with postage for heaven, then we know the Krispy Kremer was a devout boy. Sorry. Let me turn down the sass and try again. My point is that there is no real easy way to know if anyone truly is or truly believes something that is internal. Sure, you might be able to glean a good guess from some clues, but even if you put them under a metaphorical microscope and metaphorically dissect them, not only would this likely still not show you all the relevant information that you'd need, you still would not know everything going through their head. So, given this fact, there is a certain irony with someone religious complaining about how it sets a bad precedent to have civil rights operate off of something that is not able to be externally proven, like if someone is truly a gay, because the same logic is inconsistent with their own ability to validate their own freedom of religion that they adamantly would fight for. How do you know if someone is truly Christian when they're requesting Good Friday off for religious reasons? Where on their person can I identify that they are lying about this or not? I mean, this is quite the problem. If we don't do something about this, society will quickly crumble if everyone can arbitrarily claim they're Christian and gain all those religious benefits and attention. I mean, you know that everyone will take advantage of this loophole because my religion tells me that everyone is fundamentally a delinquent who will abuse a system at every turn. We must know how to tell if they're Christian or not, because everyone will just start saying they support Christians without any proof. How performative. I mean, what, do angels come down from on high and give you reward cards to fill out once you've joined the holy cause that you can show me? Collect all the saint stickers and you get a free Atom action figure, complete with replaceable rib that really transforms into a woman. Satan and Apple not included. Where did this hypocritical line of questioning come from if we've never been able to easily and unequivocally prove to others what's going on in here? Though, maybe we have been going about this the wrong way. Maybe we should have been founding the Church of Our Lord LGBTQ while claiming that a divine prophet came to us and told everyone to practice LGBTQness, or we'd go to hell, where all we'd be allowed to do is listen to our least favorite Christmas song while working in retail for eternity against an army of Karens. The point is, maybe long-standing established religions are not quite as legitimate as some of us think they are, as tangible as others are saying they are. It's just that it is important to recognize this dynamic of choice and not being able to always prove if someone believes something. I think we need to get away from this obsession of knowing things that are impossible to know, whether it's because of our limited capacity as humans or because it's something that is very literally impossible to know, regardless of if our capacity was limitless. But lots of us like to pretend that we can know things that we don't really know. And often, unfortunately, it just means that it's a toxic game of control, whether it's toxic internal control or toxic external control. Okay, so that's what I have to say about religions. And don't even get me started on the question of what separates religions from cults, which I think is probably something you should ponder on your own time and come up with some concrete answers about that question, especially if you've never considered it before. But what about cultures? The concept of culture is also pretty close to the concept of that tribalism I was talking about. There's a lot of overlap between religion and culture, let alone the culture of a religion, and a whole spectrum when it comes to how tribalism affects those concepts. But what is culture? Well, this isn't an official dictionary definition, but the way I see it is that culture is how you communicate. Not just verbal communication or written, those two, but really all aspects of communication. It's communication of art, music, of food, of new and old traditions. It's sort of like your personality and identity all wrapped up into one. Now, there is something important to be said about inherited culture versus chosen culture, as well as the difference between culture and aspects that can affect your culture. Your racialization, gender, body type, heritage, socioeconomic status are all examples of things that can have very significant effects on what winds up being your culture. But they are not your culture in of themselves, although some people wind up embracing those things as specifically being part of their culture just as well. It's sort of like how if you ask someone what's in some cookies that they've made, they don't say an oven. In this scenario, I'm wanting to know what the cookies are, not how they were formed, despite that being an important aspect in its own right, since cookies, or culture, if you've been tracking with this delicious metaphor, would be very significantly different without going through the hellfire cube that we call life for the cookies, the oven. So I think that you can decide to put different ingredients into your cookies, in a manner of speaking. And with culture, you can theoretically leave any amount of culture you were born into behind, with varying degrees of desire to do this in the first place, as well as varying degrees of difficulty or success, which can sometimes get into notions of betrayal, and that's a fun one to unpack. But let's not here, not all over my brand new technology-strewn spiderweb-themed white void floor. Considering this, I think a more autonomous way to think about what culture is that it's the things you involve yourself in, and how. That is the culture that you have. What you involve yourself in determines, or eventually determines, how you communicate. Now, with the topic of culture, we still see this dynamic that the size of your tribe matters, where there can tend to be more acceptance of a larger culture and consequently acknowledgement of bigoted actions taking place if it's directed at a large enough culture than at a smaller, lesser known one. I think you can see a similar dynamic when it comes to subcultures as well. If someone is involved in a particular subculture and the numbers just aren't there, there seems to be no significant pushback for discriminating against that person for their subculture, even if the underlying problematic logic that is being used to discriminate against that subculture is the same flawed logic that is used to discriminate against larger cultures that more people would recognize as being discriminatory. For example, if someone is being bullied for generally being a nerd, or for wearing glasses, or for watching anime, you'll still get a number of witnesses who respond to seeing that, like, hey, what the heck is your problem? Stop being a jerk. But as soon as it's someone who has a very specific, niche, nerdy interest, or wears a very specific style of glasses, or watches a very specific anime, ta-da! Despite absolutely nothing changing with the underlying dynamic or underlying logic of what's going on here, the number of people they've just made fun of are far fewer. And the pushback about those comments are similarly far fewer, even if the witnesses to this bullying don't really agree with the bullying and don't think it's nice. I think that this is because there is a severe lack of understanding in our society about what the real underlying dynamic and originator of bigotry and discrimination is. I think that some people view discrimination as only having to do with some of these larger, quite important civil rights movements. But if we want to protect ourselves from new forms and variations of bigotry, we have to have a deeper, more concrete and fundamental understanding of bigotry throughout our society. I think some people view stuff like this as okay, or not being a big deal, because any sort of bigotry towards a subculture typically doesn't have consequences that are as severe for either party involved, for the discriminator or the discriminatee, especially compared to discrimination that many people of some larger demographics have endured, although I am certain there are some exceptions. And to be clear, I am not saying that this is an entirely invalid opinion to have. The severity of discrimination towards some larger demographics is nothing to brush aside. But I think that this is a little unfair to subcultures and smaller cultures, and in a roundabout way, even unfair to the larger cultures as well, as it prevents that deeper understanding of what originates discrimination and bigotry. I think that the underlying mechanics of subcultures are very similar to larger cultures at their core or origination point. The difference seems to me to mostly be time and numbers, or more accurately, maybe time and percentage of population, not so much raw numbers. I want to make it clear that I'm not pitting larger cultures against subcultures. I mean, that obviously wouldn't be helpful. But the point is, if we want to protect culture, larger cultures as well as subcultures, we have to understand all levels of discrimination too, because they have an interconnected relationship. And this will allow us to hit the actual heart of what discrimination is so we can fully uproot it. Now, maybe you aren't on board with my line of thinking regarding cultures and religions. Maybe you think that these larger cultures and religions are simply more legitimate, or legitimate exactly because they are large. That they are these monolithic giants of reality, these never-changing entities. But something that may cause you to reconsider, at least a little bit, is contemplating the existence of the internet. Children of the internet. I was born here within the internet. I am not a real person appearing before you, simply a projection. My mind that I am was crafted in the cords and wires before the ether vibrated with Wi-Fi. So is the story of all who were privileged enough and cursed enough to be caught in its web, and now consumes all that try to escape its abyss. Some of us, and by us, I mostly mean millennials and Gen Z, we grew up with the internet. We are the children of the internet. We've not only been exposed to so many different cultures and so many subcultures, but even beyond that, the internet has a plethora of completely new subcultures within it. And by that, I mean that some of these subcultures only exist because the internet exists. The internet provides a much greater melting pot of cultures than America does now, or maybe ever did, because the barriers to all levels and types of cultures have dropped so significantly that anyone with an internet connection, who is even vaguely interested in a religion or culture that is not normally immediately accessible to them, can learn about it without much trouble, even if it still does not always result in perfect representation. 20, 30 years ago or more, you'd likely be subjected to either relying on some academic piece of work handed down to you by some reporter to learn about only a portion of a particular culture, while maybe missing lots of variations to the overall culture, or you'd have to happen to know someone in a particular community personally, and well enough so you get a glimpse at how their culture manifests in that particular community from day to day. But now, the sharing and alchemization of cultures and even beliefs is at an all-time high because of how easy the internet makes it to learn about not only the general idea of the culture or religion, but also being able to see and track how those different cultures and religions actually exist in a more direct way, moment to moment, instead of simply imagining what it must be like. Now, lots of people, understandably, look to humanity's past to determine our trajectory into the future, but there's never been anything quite like the internet and how much it has and will continue to change us, especially on the topics of religion and culture. Sure, we've had this tech for a while now, it seems pretty much the norm for many people. Basically, 2 whole generations have grown up with the internet being a predominant force in their lives. But 2 generations is still a fraction of history, and we're not really at any sort of resolution phase to what it looks like when technology is changing the landscape of society. We're still very much in the middle of this phenomenon. Despite how many people are connected to the internet, there's still billions of people who don't have internet access at all, let alone quality internet access, let alone people who actually interact with the internet in a way that maybe you or I do. You know, beyond just using it for emails, messaging, cat videos, and of course, porn. Surprisingly, there are actually a tremendous number of resources and tools for education and life improvements out here too, but who the fuck uses that shit, right? The way I describe our time right now is that we're still going through almost a global scale internet puberty. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of angst, no one really knows what's going on, and you're waiting for the rest of your body to catch up with the other various, seemingly strange developments that have been going on. Some people, regardless of their physical age, are young in their knowledge when it comes to knowing what people do and do not expect online, or knowing how to navigate the internet in general. I've never heard of this flat earth theory before, tell me more. Or maybe they haven't consented with the reality of how prevalently trolls exist in the comments section. Some people may have only recently, in the past year or few years, begun using the internet in only a fraction of the capacity that you or I might be used to using it. I see this as humanity as a whole still figuring out how to actually use this tool that we have, as well as simply being almost forced to confront the reality of other people's existence at a higher volume than ever before, learning how to genuinely interact with a variety of people. Even legally, there's still a lot of shit that needs to be officially figured out about internet usage. But if you've existed using the internet for a long time to communicate with people daily, this all possibly sounds at least a little ridiculous, because to you and I, the rules might be so natural that you don't even really need to think about it. This means that sometimes the comment section isn't in turmoil just because there are trolls, which there are, but I think it's also because you have Uncle Nitwit, who never thought about the fact that there's someone else on the other side of the internet who very possibly will read something that they would never say to that person's face. Doesn't the comments just go to some void where everyone in the audience gets to appreciate it? So the internet is causing a lot of chaos and change. Okay, sure. Up to this point, I've mostly been describing the state of things, establishing more and more concepts, even if I've made the occasional point here and there. But now that I have established these things, well, it's time to finally start bringing it all together.
The illegitimate individual and some conclusions.
I believe that the internet has been and continues to cause the largest alchemization of cultures and beliefs in history. This, unavoidably, is simultaneously creating a larger global narrative, culture, and belief structure throughout the world, while also creating many new pockets of very niche, unique, and never-before-seen mashups of these beliefs and cultures otherwise not possible. While we also have a society that has tribalism ingrained in both the official and unofficial rights that we allow ourselves to have, despite our messaging of religious and cultural freedom. But since the internet is churning out more and more individuals with alternate beliefs to the traditional, it's something we must address. We can't just ignore it, because this trend is only going to continue to escalate. This is why we need to shift our understanding of what religion and culture is, because all of this is both more unifying and more ostracizing than ever before, but in different ways. Though this isn't purely concerned for these larger concepts of cultures and subcultures, the effects of the internet need to be addressed on an individual level. So, a term I'd like to add to this conversation is personal culture, which is how I've come to describe all of the different cultures and subcultures that you, or I, personally, as an individual, are involved in. A similar, almost equivalent term is identity, but the term personal culture, I think, invokes a somewhat more fluid nature and encompasses more than just the fronts on which people tend to scope the idea of identity to, while also highlighting not just labels, but the way that someone interacts with their identity and labels, while also incorporating the intersectionality of existing in multiple demographics. One way to think about it is that identity is what you are, while your personal culture is how you interact with what you are. You can think of how someone of mixed cultural backgrounds might interact differently with that identity than someone else with the very same mixed background. Or just because I am an American and therefore contribute and belong to the idea of American culture, it does not mean that I interact with American culture the same way that any number of other Americans do. I have my own unique personal culture, as does everyone else. In my own experience, I've involved myself in so many subcultures that at this point I actually have trouble finding other people who are in most of the same subcultures as I am, simply because of how many different combinations of subcultures are out there for everyone else to be involved in. So what I've perceived is that newer generations are, numerically at least, involved in more varied subcultures than our predecessors, creating more and more unique personal cultures. I identify more strongly with some of the personal beliefs I have and personal culture that I have than I do with many of the larger cultures, subcultures, and belief systems that exist out there in the world. In a way, I think this makes it harder for everyone to relate to each other in some capacity, or harder for you to find your people, to find others that have enough similar shared experiences, which is a problem. A problem that I think older generations did not have to contend with as much because their cultures and their experiences were, comparatively at least, more insular, having more in common with one another than peers of newer generations. But one thing we can and are doing to bring that sense of larger community back around is rallying behind common ethics and morals. Religions often do have some opinion on morality, but how that ideal actually plays out is another matter, and whether or not that morality is actually tested and quantified is an issue. I mean, is there a purely quantitative and qualitative ethics and morals based religion out there somewhere? Like, hello, hi, where are you? Now, I started talking about personal culture, and a very curious thing about that idea, in my own experience, is that the larger American cultural narrative has a big emphasis on individuality, and alongside that, not just certain specific freedoms, but a kind of more general individual freedom that is thought to be granted to everyone here. You know, freedom. That thing that America has sole ownership over. There's a lot of cultural focus on this idea of individual freedom in America, that you are the master of your own destiny, that you and you alone can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be anyone you want to be, even the president. Supposedly. Of course, only so long as it works well within the box, the rules of capitalism. Individuality is, surprisingly, a value that I do personally agree with as well, if you could not tell. I embrace individualism quite a bit. I think it's good to embrace this and is a very important part of someone's journey in maturity. But I do want to balance out that mindset of individualism and that statement that I made in support of it with the idea that community, but not tribalism, is also important for an individual's maturity as well. These two concepts don't necessarily conflict. So, why is it that in a country that has such an emphasis on personal freedom and praise of individualism, how is it that there's a lot of discrediting of individuality that still goes around? This discrediting that often seems to come from individuals who cry the loudest about the beauty of American freedom. American freedom until you work a job. Then you give up all your rights to your corporate overlords. And considering working hours are most of everyone's waking social hours, especially in a crony capitalist country, this is a pretty large chunk of personal freedom and individuality that no longer actually exists in practice. But if the behavior in question doesn't directly and largely go against the job description's functional role, then I think however you want to look should be allowed. Just let people exist. Let them be themselves. Which brings me to the real reason I've made this entire video. You see, it's all just been one big ruse to justify my own wild and wacky decisions. While it might not prove my points, it is some personal supporting evidence for everything that I've been arguing. And it might help to explain some of why this is such an important topic to me. See, although these contacts don't pop on camera the way they do in person, back in 2015, I decided to start wearing them on the regular, and I do still, nearly everywhere I go. But why red? Why this of all things? There are so many other ways you can express yourself, you edgy edgelord. Look, you might not believe me but I do not like vampires, I'm not going for demonic couture, and I'm not a Reaper main. But while my underlying point is that there should not be limitations to how self-expression is communicated, that we shouldn't have an arbitrary set of acceptable and unacceptable forms of self-expression, or so many rules around where this self-expression is allowed, I do think that explaining the reasoning behind this particular aesthetic that I have chosen to express is so important because it can help demonstrate that despite possibly an initial discounting of anything meaningful behind other people's forms of self-expression, that there can be an underlying logic, history, and culture behind aspects we might not identify with. So after I share why this aesthetic in particular, I will also share what literally happened once I decided to start being more myself. I think it's also essential to highlight that this was a tough decision for me personally. A very easy way that some people will discredit you if you're breaking social norms, especially with any amount of confidence, is to assume that there must be some sort of obliviousness going on. Otherwise, no one would possibly choose to do something like this if they're socially aware, right? But the anxiety is excruciating. I was working at Starbucks as a barista. I'd worked as a barista for about 2, almost 3 years at this point, and held a couple of other retail positions in the past at the Gap and at Barnes & Noble. At one point, I was working both at Starbucks and the Gap at the same time, doing openings at Starbucks and closings at the Gap back to back. Big oof. For a short bit, I was also in college while doing this. I was really living, like a zombie. I don't know if you've ever personally worked a retail position before, but it can be fairly dehumanizing. Some retail positions more than others. Lots, not all, but lots of people come into the store and barely acknowledge your existence. Really makes you love your job, Being a ghost is cool, right? Now, this dehumanizing hits on multiple, very nuanced levels that you may or may not be sensitive to, that can really just start to get to you. And at some point, I realized that I spent more time externally presenting myself to others as a tool of these companies, rather than presenting myself to others as just myself, who happened to also have a job. Presenting myself as a tool for companies that definitely were not paying me enough to become a completely different person at work. One of the problems with these retail jobs, especially my experience at Starbucks, is that many of them demand you to fulfill 3 very large roles all at once. Something that many other jobs do not demand of you, even some other retail jobs. They ask you to work in the role of hospitality, in the role of sales, and in the role of almost factory worker-like efficiency, all at once. And it is exhausting, without much to show for it, too. Exhaustion that is so severe that it can creep into your time off, preventing you from having the energy you need to find something better. But that's another video entirely. The point is, I was so disillusioned and exhausted with the hustle that in order to get through it, I needed to reclaim myself as an individual because of how much time was being spent not myself. And why, pray tell, would reclaiming myself as an individual ever take on the form of wearing red contacts? Well, my sweet summer spawn, I shall tell you. So, I grew up watching a lot of anime. I know, maybe not my best opening line. But let me get ahead of all the comments calling me a weeb, because despite how there may be a portion of truth to that, it wasn't really just anime by a long shot. Basically, every moment I wasn't working or going to school was spent immersing myself in absolutely wonderfully engaging fantasy stories. I consumed them. It was one of my primary interests. Lots of books, comics, video games, artwork, all with a heavy fantasy leaning to them, more often than not. I was enthralled with the pure creativity I would find, and eventually I felt like the imagination was my realm of existence. I would often, and still do, use my imagination to conjure up my own unique tales using the material I'd gained from all of these creative works. I read books like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, the Chrestomanci series, the Bartimaeus trilogy, comics like Spider-Man, Deadpool, Batman, The Sandman, played video games like Warcraft, Final Fantasy, Heroes of Might and Magic, Golden Sun, and Kingdom Hearts, and watched shows like Naruto, Bleach, and Death Note, and so many more. I'd taken all of the concepts, the tropes, the arts, and the symbolism into myself so much, and some of those fantasy elements I found so very cool. So when I conceptualized the kind of person I would like to be, what I saw as cool, which is such an unfortunate and frustratingly subjective word, I saw myself through the lens of all of these fantasy elements I'd consumed. And for whatever reason, I always found the characters with red aesthetics and various elven characteristics as that cool that I especially liked. In a very meaningful way, I was allowing myself to be seen as the person I felt best reflected my own experiences because this was my whole world, everything I cared about. I wasn't interested in simply dressing up with costumes and makeup at a convention or only for photos or videos, because I viewed that too much as just pretending, too temporary. I wanted to manifest and persist how I actually saw the ideal version of myself as something consistent. This notion is more fulfilling to me. So I hope that explains at least some of why I've chosen this particular aesthetic to rebelliously be myself with. But what literally happened when I finally decided to go for it and start wearing the contacts just all over the heckin' place? So for myself, I was really stepping into unknown territory. I'd never heard of anyone else doing anything like this before, and I really wasn't sure what to expect. I figured there would be some pushback for me being myself in general, but who really knew how much pushback or how it would play out? I suppose you could say that I doubted my own fears as being legitimate, that I acknowledged the possibility that I was just being a little paranoid, and I hoped that I was just wrong to be worried. That maybe everyone else was actually way more chill about stuff than I thought, and that the narrative of American freedom that I'd been taught was actually true. I did prepare for the possibility that I would lose my job, which I saw as worth it if it meant standing up for something real that actually mattered to me. But while I think personal sacrifice can be meaningful in the right context, I didn't want to be irresponsible and go into it without preparing for a possible bad outcome. So I made sure to save up about 3 months' worth of rent as I became more and more convinced that this was something I needed to do for myself. I had also been teaching myself how to code apps and websites for some time already, although really the primary reason I was teaching myself how to program had nothing to do with preparing for a bad outcome here and more to do with the app that I was wanting to build called LifeNav, which is in alpha right now. Check it out in the description below for more details. But I actually wound up working for Starbucks for about 2 whole months while wearing the contacts before I was eventually fired. Big surprise, I know. During that time, though, I genuinely felt some liberation. Work was more interesting, the mundane was now exciting. I actually looked forward to interacting with customers because I was finally being myself. And because it wasn't just, hi, how are you? Oh, that's your order. Okay, well, hello to you too. At least I looked forward to interacting with people after the first few weeks of initial terror, because I was so worried that people would react negatively. But to my relief, they didn't. Initially, the store manager didn't push back about it at all, or even really acknowledge it. Part of this was, I'm sure, because it wasn't something they knew what to think of in general. But I would like to think that some of it was also the fact that I had just won Employee of the Quarter award, because I got along with my coworkers and customers brilliantly, because I had never been written up before, because I also worked hard, because I knew my job very well, because I came in early, I stayed late, I picked up others' shifts when needed, and on top of that, The store manager had actually told me several times that I was a good worker because I was, and I quote, no drama. I showed them, didn't I? But then, alas, the district manager came in and saw, did very little to hear my personal reasons for looking how I felt, and they made the decision to tell me I was not allowed to wear the contacts, despite it not going against the dress code even a little, which I was extremely careful to check beforehand and pointed out to them, but they insisted I take them off. Though, for what concrete reason, I'm not really certain. What quantifiable negative effects do you think wearing these contacts would even possibly cause? I mean, are you really going to tell me that some people are not going to get Starbucks just because there's some weirdo behind the counter? Yeah, right. I mean, some people even think that the zealous coffee drinking of the Starbucks cult may be because, as one Pastor James David Manning puts it,
semen is another kind of milk.
A number of people think that semen tastes good.
So Starbucks has figured it out. So they blend a little semen synthetic with their synthetic blends of milk.
Though, as an ex-Starbucks barista myself, I can assure you, Pastor Manning, as sad as this may make some people to hear, there is no semen in the drinks. Just think of the health violations. Quaza would have an absolute tantrum. I did fight their decision to fire me with logic and with an emotional appeal. My best attempts to explain how important this was to me and why. I even reached out to corporate to explain I was being asked to do something that wasn't in the dress code or job description. But honestly, I was probably too reasonable and calm about it. Not once did I allow myself to respond to the situation in a volatile or upset manner, because I thought that I would completely destroy my chances of reasoning with them. In hindsight, now knowing what type of people my district and store managers are, and maybe just knowing more about the nature of others in general, I know for certain that they either lacked the understanding or lacked the compassion to appeal to logic and or empathy-based reasoning. Instead, what I probably would have had to have done to make them leave me alone would be to threaten them with some sort of legal situation, which, surprise, wasn't really something I set out to do. Not really in my list of goals. So, after being fired, I applied for unemployment, but I was denied because Starbucks blocked it. I fought through many layers of the court in an attempt to have them reverse their decision to deny me unemployment. Now, New Jersey, unfortunately, is an at-will state, which basically means employers can fire you for any reason. But how that relates to if you get unemployment or not is an entirely different story. And since I hadn't violated any of the company's policies, I should have been able to. Despite representing myself admirably, all the way until the Supreme Court of New Jersey, they would not reverse the decision. And after a couple years of this going on, I decided to drop the situation since it had eaten up lots of my time and money pursuing justice. There are many details to all of that I've talked about in other videos at length, which include showing some blatant lies that Starbucks or my managers added to their testimony, as well as an arbitrator who basically bullied me out of even trying to present my case, and it would take up many hours to explain everything in true detail, which is not really the focus of this video. So, after being fired, while still in the middle of these court hearings, I went on to attend a coding boot camp in New York City called General Assembly, and was then fortunate enough to land a paid internship at a startup that did not care if I wore red contacts or not. After a couple years, I wound up making more than the baseline salary of the district manager that fired me, which was a nice validating feeling. And that is pretty much how that whole arc played out. Yay! Or something. So at the time, my primary concern was not really how do I legally protect my own beliefs and freedom. Sure, maybe it would have been ideal if I had a whole legal plan laid out, but the thing is, even if I had done something like that, legally created a religion to protect my personal beliefs under the law, I am certain I'd still need to jump through so many extra hoops and fight many battles to access that religious protection that America claims to provide, because it appears that many people are not used to interfacing with the idea of small-scale religions. As it currently seems to stand, there's not really much of any credence given to individuals' beliefs or culture in America, only group beliefs and culture. And if that group isn't large enough, if not as many other people are aware of the group's culture, that freedom that America claims it provides still sometimes is non-existent. This is because there are two brands of freedom. First, there's the brand that you just have, the one that you never have to fight for. There's no proving that it's culturally appropriate to wear, for example, a suit and tie in America. No one is out there saying that you can't wear this unless you prove the cultural significance of it. But then there's the other brand of freedom, the one you do have to fight for. But if my existence demands proof of its legitimacy, I don't have the first type of freedom. But the first type of freedom is the version we should all really be provided, the one we're told America provides. Providing proof, even if I am then eventually vindicated by that proof, means that I still had to fight for my freedom in some capacity. It can be time-consuming, money-intensive, emotionally taxing, and also has the threat of denying part of your existence if adequate proof is not able to be presented, since I don't think most people catalog a list of evidence to show others that every part of their external appearance is based on some long-standing involvement and deep investment in some heritage or culture. Or even if you were able to provide a whole briefcase of proof, you could also happen to be talking with someone or have a judge who is not morally or logically as sound as they should be, which does unfortunately happen. Some might think the system we have in place is the natural way things just inevitably or unavoidably are, that it necessarily needs to put people through hell in order to maintain justice. But I disagree. Things might naturally work this way given the system we've adopted, but if we have a society more specifically versed in agnostic morals and ethics, I can imagine a system that is less invasive and more inclusive, providing the first type of freedom that we should all have. One of the reasons we have this divide with these two types of freedoms, this constant threat of minorities and individuals having to prove themselves in a way that the majority does not, is because we have a system built on respect of these larger monolithic cultures, when really we should have a respect built on an individual basis, regardless of what religion or culture someone is attached to. Building respect and authenticity around larger cultures invokes a dynamic where everyone becomes their own little judge, parsing out which people qualify for this respect and which do not. Given this way of thinking, if you don't have respect for people on an individual level, and you come across someone who displays cultural aesthetics that you have no previous knowledge of, the end result will most likely be that of discrimination. And now, especially with the internet, people who share lots of culture or beliefs can be very decentralized. So, it is more likely that people who only give larger groups or movements any credence will not have any knowledge of one of these newer cultures or beliefs, since there isn't the local church nearby for them to see with more obvious proof that it is a large movement. So I'm going to give an analogy to make a point about the flaw I see in how it appears many people interact with defending the expression of their culture. How there is a tendency to raise up elements of an established history to any particular expression they are displaying, to highlight that they are not the only ones who are connected to this particular form of self-expression. And to be fair, sometimes it's the only argument that will succeed in providing the needed protection. To that end, if the argument works, it works. Now, while this approach to defense is one that can be very relatable, which is one of the reasons it's so appealing to want to use, Just because it might be relatable to many does not mean it is logically impenetrable. Logically impervious. And while this might seem like a reasonable defense, since many people can hopefully recognize how horrible that would be if someone they loved were picked, it doesn't, however, say anything about the negative side effects that are caused by trying to find someone that is not loved, so as to validly sacrifice them according to our new rules that our argument has thus just implied. Okay, that analogy was even darker than I thought it'd be. Maybe a better argument to make in this analogy would be that everyone deserves the same amount of consideration that we'd want for ourselves, regardless of personal attachments. And by constructing a society to include sacrifices at all, would be enforcing a fundamentally chaotic and unstable community. Your existence as a human being should not hinge on if you can prove that your existence is tied to another specific set of people. Your self-expression is not only valid if you can demonstrate to others that it has ties to a long cultural history. Of course, there are many ways that you can alter that hypothetical to make it more and more difficult to construct a defense. Like, as soon as you bring in the dynamic of a society enforcing sacrifices simply as blind religious zealotry, I don't know if any level of logic would do the job. Which, to be fair, I suppose a culture that's sacrificing people ritualistically is probably some level of, zealot, but just ignore that, I guess. The reason I am critical of this ancestral-based defense of cultural elements is because if we establish this defense that there is a legitimacy to large cultures as opposed to a personal culture, and any or some freedoms hinge on this aspect, then the focus will logically move on to proving two things. One, that the individual in question is legitimately involved in said culture, but also, two, that the claimed culture is actually even legitimate culture at all, both of which are absolutely nightmarish to try and prove, since these things are very organic and no one typically has a filing cabinet at home that catalogs all the evidence to show someone else that this culture is real, established, and that you're involved in it. And I mean this both in a strictly legal sense as well as just between regular people day to day. But if we move away from defending freedoms based on our ties to these larger cultures, away from using that as a defense, and instead replace it with a defense that I believe works better, which is a defense that is focused more on an individual's freedom to express whatever personal culture they wish, where it's not tied down to any one particular monolith, this would help remove the dynamic that we can somehow prove or disprove some set of legitimate or illegitimate cultures, seeing as this will help to establish the idea that all people are provided the freedom to express themselves in any which way they feel without danger of oppressive consequences, since trying to prove the legitimacy of a personal culture would be even that much more tedious in the confines of the legal system, especially considering personal cultures are intended to be somewhat fluid as everyone grows and changes. Now, at least three important caveats to this is, one, once again, your own personal culture cannot validly include controlling other people's personal culture. Again, I'll reference the paradox of tolerance. The second caveat is that respect is not a one-way street. So while I encourage this alchemizing of cultures into new cultures and personal cultures, stealing something deeply meaningful from someone else in a very, I'll say, appropriative way is not something I encourage, which is a whole topic that deserves an entire series of videos on its own. And the last caveat is, for the workplace setting, that self-expression must not directly or significantly hinder a person's job within that role, which, to be fair, that qualifier still has plenty of room in it to need some discernment, and people would still fight over it. But I do think that the bar should be much higher for what we can all be flexible with when it comes to self-expression, personal culture, personal beliefs, and personal identity. in general as well as in the workplace. One thing that is very important to clarify while I'm advocating for individual rights is that there is very important work that still needs to be done for larger groups of people who experience very specific kinds of discrimination. There is an urgency that can demand our attention towards putting out intentionally set fires. So I'm not trying to say that no one can also be doing good work towards putting those fires out, or fighting unique battles only certain communities or demographics face. I am not advocating for abandoning everything else for the sake of the individual. This isn't an either or, but an and. Even still, I do believe we should all be able to find unity in focusing on securing the rights of all people as individuals. And my argument for shifting the narrative this way is that the current underlying framework that we have surrounding social identity and the constructs there are fundamentally flawed in a way that sets up a system that will always be broken if we continue to operate under this paradigm because of the way communication, knowledge, and ignorance works. We will never not have people who are some level of ignorant, since we're all born not knowing pretty much anything, really. But when it comes to knowledge of some other cultures or other demographics we aren't immediately a part of, if we are ignorant to these cultures, this ignorance should not also mean that we will most likely be a bigot because of this lack of knowledge. And we need to ensure that there is a place for ignorant folk who are working to be less ignorant because they have their fundamental philosophies and morals sorted. But I think that right now, we can't necessarily trust that they do. Besides recognizing that it would be unjust to discriminate against someone based on their culture and the expression of that culture, many people also even more easily recognize that it is unjust to discriminate against someone on the lines of traits they are unable to change, or at least not easily able to change, as if they should want to change them. Examples of this would be things like skin color, sex, lots of things up the ableism alley, basically anything that someone was born with. Though it is surprising to think that this recognition of injustice has not always been the case, and that there are still some notable number of individuals who will judge on these lines. But I think it is a bit of a trap to define bigotry as either or both of these. It is true that they are forms of bigotry, but while maybe they are the two of the easiest or clearest forms of bigotry to identify, it is not actually the heart of the bigotry and discrimination problem. I mean, at least according to me, I guess. But before I share what I believe the heart of bigotry is, we're going to imagine, as a thought experiment, just fun, that it is possible for everyone to, on a whim, within a moment, change any of the traits they were born with, which would be great. I would love that ability. But would this altering of reality suddenly erase bigotry and discrimination simply because everyone would have the ability to change themselves this way? I have to say that I really don't think it would. Sure, some dynamics might be a bit different. Maybe overall it would help lots of things. But inevitably, there would be some people who would be brave enough to be themselves no matter who they were around. And there would be a whole set of people out there that would then judge their choice to appear a particular way. The vast majority of personal choices should not be discriminated against. If the only way you can convince someone that they should be allowed to exist is because you don't have a choice in the matter at hand, the argument only serves to make bigots say, oh, well, they just can't help it. It's just how they are, which implies that if you could help it, if you did have a choice in the matter, that they think you should choose otherwise. Which, I don't know about you, but that's not really what I would like the takeaway to be. That doesn't make someone not bigoted if they just give you a pass because you can't change the one thing they think you'd be better without. And yes, if this argument works, it works. If it provides peace, it provides peace. You don't necessarily need to change everyone's mind in order to have a certain amount of peace. I think that people are far more likely to contend with these questions when faced with something like my contacts that are blatantly an active personal choice. I very specifically, actively, have to have chosen to wear these contacts. There are no accidents or regrets here. If I felt insecure about them, or I didn't like how they looked, I would immediately take them off. Contend with that! And this is what got me thinking about the choice discrimination paradox in the first place. So I think that what I would describe the heart of bigotry as is a sort of misapplied negative moralization or judgment of something. Whether it is a misapplied judgment to something that is changeable or not, a personal choice or not. Bigotry might be easier to see if the hatred knob is turned up, or if the heat is applied to some aspects people are sensitive about. But if the bigotry is only simmering, that doesn't mean that it's still not burning. In this scenario, we don't want things to burn. But what about when the idea of choice is used abusively? Oh, what do I mean by that? Honestly, in general, it just seems like humans predominantly have an unhealthy relationship with the concept of free will and choice. Maybe it could have something to do with it being commodified, and that doesn't mean, necessarily, through the direct monetary means. A sort of moral commodity for power has been used in the past before capitalism really took root. Capitalism just put its own literal brand on bigotry and sold it to all of us. So all of that being said, where does that leave us? Well, I'm going to bring up that amazing paradox I crafted earlier and add a little tiny second part to it as a solution. In order for these two ideals to work cohesively, society must not only delineate the given demographics that should not be discriminated against, but it needs to delineate what types of choices and actions should and should not be judged to avoid discrimination in practice. While that is still a very general description of what I think we should be aiming for, it does help give at least some goal or solution to aim for instead of just pointing out a problem. Investigating, teaching, and learning about morals and ethics is a really good way to build a more agnostic framework for our society, helping us work better together to create a more cohesive and common experience that could unify us, while we continue to also be more and more unique from one another in other ways. Of course, a lot of this knowledge and philosophy already exists out there. Far more dedicated people than I have poured their entire lives into creating a better society for us all on these subjects. But none of it really matters if more of us don't unify around actually having an understanding of these common ethics. What I would like to advocate for more of is to get away from treating morals, ethics, and philosophy as some niche topic left to big brain individuals to intellectually jerk themselves off to, and instead ground things a bit more by focusing on practical ethics and philosophy rather than using these thought experiments as a bludgeoning tool to exert a sense of faux superiority or use it to hold useless nihilistic perspectives of we're all just tiny specks of dust in the cosmos and nothing we do really matters if I can't change the entire fucking universe. Last I checked, none of us are cosmic-sized planets that exist outside of time. We're all human beings with human concerns and human needs. Just because it's possible to smoke shrooms and imagine yourself as a literal mountain existing over thousands of years, it doesn't mean that's fucking useful to anyone, yourself included. Okay, there might be a personal gripe of mine somewhere in here, so I'll think real hard about apologizing for that outburst. Establishing a unifying set of morals and ethics starts with education. Education being a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and one of the reasons I was inspired to work on LifeNav. So hopefully that helps the world? So after all of that, to summarize, the TLDR is that self-expression is very important, even if we do not always relate or recognize the self-expression we witness in others, even if we think it's silly or absurd or we want to discredit it in any number of ways. Expression should not be gatekept so heavily, and businesses should largely not be allowed to mandate how you express yourself, as I do see this as an abuse of power. This abuse of power is acknowledged by many when seen on a larger scale towards recognized cultures and religions, but is downplayed when the same thing is done towards an individual and their personal culture. And lastly, other people and companies will use the fact that self-expression is a choice to get you to reduce yourself for them. But just because you can choose to stifle your own self-expression, it does not mean that that pressure you're receiving to do so should be accepted. Because really, it is just another form of bigotry. Just another excuse to treat others badly. Writing this video has been an exploration of my personal philosophy on some things, and a solidification of philosophies I've held for a long time, but never put into words. It's also been an exploration and solidification of parts of my own identity, unconventional as all the fanfare may be. And on that note of identity, while I have you here, I have one last thing to share about that. I've never liked labels, not so much because they shouldn't exist, but because they're an obnoxious reminder of the terribly flawed way many people interface with them. How they're not only often restrictive, preventing a more natural growth, but also that they're often used divisively. How the labels can come to mean different things to different people, which can sort of defeat the very purpose of them. How their meanings can be hijacked for political purposes and completely redefined into something that originally it was not. I don't believe in relying on labels so much because labels are like the clothes of philosophies. Anyone can wear them, and they all fit differently on each individual. They don't necessarily tell you all that much about the person who wears them compared to actually hearing the thought processes of those people and tracking their actions accordingly. But similar to my realizations about how people predominantly do not inquire about or investigate your story if you do not tell it loudly on your own, I've also come to grasps with how people will label you even if you do not specifically choose one. People will fully apply identities to you without direct evidence or apply labels to you without really understanding the labels they're using in the first place, whether you like it or not. So, for those of you who may wish that I clearly and definitively apply a label to myself so that you can know for certain, I will oblige. I am me, and I will continue to become more me until the end of time. I will not stop being myself. I'll never stop. I always have and always will be. That is my gender, my sexuality, and my political affiliation. Yes, we're doing the bathtub meme. Welcome. I can only assume that if you've made it all the way here, that on some level you appreciate hearing my thoughts on all of this. And I, in return, appreciate you for hearing them. Genuinely. It means a lot to me. And I know how much I left out, even though this whole thing was just an absolutely massive video. 36 pages by the end, and I still had 34 pages of just notes and fragments of thoughts. And that was while I didn't even attempt to approach tackling certain very important topics and concepts connected to this. So I know there are many other thoughts and perspectives that deserve to be included in this conversation, and I want to hear them. So please, I invite you to let me know what you think, let others know what you think, and if I find that there's some oversight that needs to be addressed, I will add it to the description or the comment below. So please look there for that. This video took a lot of time and effort to put together, especially since I'm not currently able to do this full time and do not have a team of minions to order about, which is a real shame, you know? And I still may do more videos in the future, but it's really not certain. Maybe my thoughts about sexuality, or some thoughts on logic, or what art really is. Maybe something else entirely, if I can get the support to do that. But for now, I have two other very important projects I'm working on that will be my focus instead. One of them is a bit secretive, but what I can tell you is that it's a video game that is all about crafting music as a game mechanic, layered with an introspective, interpersonal story. If you like the game Hades, that is a bit of the direction that it is currently heading in, although there are a few notable differences. The other very large project is an app that I've been coding called LifeNav, which is in alpha right now. It is an achievement system for life. Any goal you can imagine you might typically have in life, like how to play the guitar, for example, would be in the app in incremental, bite-sized goals, and then provides curated tools and information around the internet for how to accomplish this achievement. I am all about gamifying real life in a positive manner. If you want to explore the app, you can go to lifenav.life. There is also a link in the description or the comments, along with a link to my Patreon if you are kind enough to support these projects, which will gain you access to my Discord and a closer eye on the projects in the progress. If you can't throw anything monetary around, but would still like to help, liking, sharing, and commenting do probably more than you think. So I super appreciate that as well. Thank you very much, and farewell, friends.
You know, I was playing World of Warcraft at one point, and then at some point I got into Final Fantasy, and look at what it's done to me. Warn your kids. Warn your kids.